Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special episode of Saturday Morning Live with Sister Vassa. Today, as you see, we have a surprise guest. Professor Aristotle Papanikolaou of Fordham University, Greek Orthodox theologian, well known around the world, really, but his home base is New York City, the Fordham University Orthodox Christian Studies Center, and he is the co-director, together with Professor George Demokopoulos. Maybe we'll put a picture of him up if we can find a place on this screen to put up a picture. I'd like to tell you just a bit more, and then we will let him do most of the talking, everybody. But if you believe that for a second, then you haven't been really paying attention to this show. But let me tell you that he is born and raised in Chicago in a Greek Orthodox family. In fact, his father was a priest, sadly recently deceased, yes, in 2015, a priest at the same parish for 50 years, yes. Yeah. So that experience I share with Professor Papanikolaou, since my beloved father is also a priest for as many years, thankfully still with us. So Professor Papanikolaou's areas of expertise, I'll just say briefly, are generally speaking Eastern Orthodox theology, Trinitarian theology, political theology, and most currently his research agenda relates to theological anthropology. And something I find fascinating, and I hope we'll have time to discuss with him today, is he has been researching the dynamics of truth-telling. And in parentheses, he defines that as confession. Truth-telling, the dynamics of that for what it means to one's identity, for what it means for being human, and the impact of truth-telling on human emotions and desires. So I do find this fascinating, and I will be asking him about this. So Professor Papanikolaou, finally, I would ask you to share with us, for example, I think a fascinating topic. Why is it that you, born and raised in Chicago, but not having gone on to become a priest like your father, did study Orthodox theology at an Orthodox seminary, something I didn't mention, right? He studied theology, everybody, at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox Seminary in Brookline, Massachusetts. So why did you decide to go to seminary and then, if I may ask, not go on to become a priest?
Well, I went to seminary originally to become a priest, and I just noticed that I like learning and reading about the church, about the faith. I think I read my first theology book in my teens. I'm trying to remember whether it was Carlos Ware's Orthodox Church, the first book for so many of us. I think it might have been some other book in my dad's library, but I did eventually get around to
Not anymore, though.
Yeah.
That book has been burned, right. In case you haven't heard.
So I went to Holy Cross to become a priest, and then I just noticed that I love reading and learning about Orthodox theology, and I had a friend who went for a PhD at Notre Dame to study under your mentor Robert Taft, and I saw that he did that, and
your friend John Klentos.
John Klentos, yeah,
who wrote his PhD on Evergetis.
Right.
Typhicon.
Right, and I just kind of thought, well, yeah, that's a good idea. Let me do that PhD thing. I mean, I still thought I was going to still be a priest even when I was going for my PhD, but then I felt I needed to just focus on scholarship and teaching and try to do that very well, and so I wound up not becoming a priest. I also felt that there was, perhaps that was my real calling, to be a lay theologian in the church and to show people that in fact that there can be lay theologians at the church, there have been lay theologians at the church, and so I felt that was maybe my particular calling as well. And also, I mean, as a lay theologian teaching at a Catholic university, I think I have also a certain amount of flexibility to address topics and issues and examine certain questions that confront the church.
You have a certain what? Flexibility, you said? Or did you say
Yeah.
freedom? You didn't say freedom.
Yeah, freedom.
No?
But freedom and flexibility.
You mean flexibility in the sense of time management? Or do you mean something else?
Yeah, I think that there's a certain amount where...
The topic is truth-telling.
Right,
Professor.
truth-telling. Yeah, I think that it does allow me a certain... I do think that there are certain topics that are difficult within the institutional church setting, whether it's a parish or whether it's at the seminary, to be brought up and to be discussed. And I think that one of the reasons why we started our center, our Orthodox Christian Studies Center, was to provide a space, perhaps, for there to be kind of free discussion, free flow of thought on practically any topic. Not any topic, because we do have our we do draw the line at certain places, and so we won't. Our center is really not going to have a conference debating the divinity of Christ. That's part of the dogmatic tradition. That's non-negotiable. But we also feel that the dogmas of the church, which, if you really think about it, are really just few. They're not really. It's not really a big book of dogmas. They're all centered around the person of Christ, who Jesus is, and they really set the parameters for discussion and debate. They don't really stifle it. They're trying to set the ground rules. Right. So from that point of view, we try to work with them. We try to think and work and live within that dogmatic tradition, and we try to confront challenges and questions, and we don't necessarily set a limit on the kinds of things that people want to talk about through the various venues of our center.
Well, thank you, Professor. See, why do you have to have that name?
Just say thank you, Professor. You can say
Professor
Aristotle. My students like.
All right. Thank you, Professor. I find that very interesting, and I find it particularly interesting the restrictions on discussion, not specifically coming from our church culture, which I don't think is actually inherent to Orthodox church culture. Certainly our patristic tradition is all about discussion, all about diving into also polemics and having serious arguments also about dogmatic issues.
Right.
So, but I do think that increasingly our internet culture, our political climate, has everybody quite afraid of saying anything.
Right.
And it's interesting to me how this interplay of our internet culture and church culture might be, you can't see what came first, the chicken or the egg here, but everybody's turned into a chicken somehow. And those of us that engage in some level of public speaking might feel quite paralyzed to discuss anything slightly controversial even, because a misstep in this or that direction, because, say, somebody that does have an academic mind might be interested in talking about those gray zones. It's the problematic things, not the things that nobody needs to discuss, that we discuss. This could just, have us crossed out of the book of life by many, that just people go hysterical about a misstep. And it's not only in our church sphere, not even especially. I would say we've seen the careers of certain celebrities, yes, sometimes for something very serious, but sometimes really for a statement. So I just wonder how you deal with this in what you do. Are you aware of trying to foster a healthy climate of discussion? Or do you have, what we perceive? I've been living in Europe for a long time now, and there's a picture that is created about American universities about having what are they called? Safe spaces?
Mm-hmm.
Safe from like triggers or something like
Right,
this?
right. There's all kinds of now within. So that's two separate areas in a way. I mean, there's the broader cultural problem of how to foster conversations even within what you normally would think would be a safe zone. Like the American university should be considered in generally a safe zone where people are free flow of ideas. And I think there are some universities that are like that still, but I do understand how some people feel that perhaps there is even a bias cutting through the American higher education system. I think for the Orthodox Christian Studies Center, we, through just simply our activities, we try to make a statement that there are things that we can and should talk about. Now, there are people who disagree with that, but that's the point. In other words, we're making a particular statement. We feel that we have good theological reasons for why we can foster these kinds of discussions through various venues. We have a blog called Public Orthodoxy. We have conferences. We have publications. We do public speaking through our teaching, through our doctoral students, through so many kinds of things. And there are those who feel that certain ways in which we think about these kinds of questions and they're theological, they're social, they're moral. They're not just a few questions. So there are people who feel that orthodoxy is defined by a kind of a certain settling of questions, and we think again that somehow I think one of the things that is remarkable really about orthodoxy on a more positive side is, yes, we have these kinds of jurisdictional disputes. Yes, we have these debates that sometimes don't go well about what can or can't be talked about, and
Do we have jurisdictional disputes, Professor?
but it doesn't really affect. We recently had a public orthodoxy post from a Lutheran theologian who kind of made this remark, so I'm really getting it from him. But I've thought about it myself. It doesn't really affect how any of us approach the Eucharist. And we still have that unity in the Eucharist. I mean, even with people that I disagree with publicly, I somehow still have seen moments where I've come together with them in the Eucharist, and that to me indicates something. That indicates that our unity really is grounded in our worship, and our worship then allows us then or challenges us then to figure out how we should actually engage in these inevitable discussions, these inevitable questions, these inevitable kinds of challenges in ways that mirror what we're trying to live in and through the Eucharist.
You're aware that there was a break in Eucharistic communion?
I am. Yeah.
Unilaterally from one church?
Yeah.
So, what do you mean by we still approach the same Eucharist?
Well, I mean, I do think that, I think even there, I mean, I understand why the Russian Orthodox Church felt they needed to do it. I don't necessarily agree. I think this is a jurisdictional dispute. It's not a dogmatic dispute. Some people are claiming it's a dogmatic dispute because the ecumenical patriarch is trying to act like a pope. Claiming papal privileges and actually acting in a way that people disagree with are two different things, really. I understand that move, and I think in the long arc of Orthodox history, it's going to be significant, but I don't think it's going to be long-term. I do think, though, that I'm also hearing stories that even those who are under the Russian Orthodox Church globally, I mean, in these local areas, yes, there's an official break of communion, but in these local areas, people are not necessarily acting in accordance with that official declaration. Mm. And so I do think that there's something about the Eucharist that, and there's something about even local, relationships and the way local Orthodox Christians interact with each other that somehow always points to something remarkable that we have. I think. Something remarkable.
Would you agree that for us in the diaspora, some of the issues in the home countries are also, they play out very differently for us? No, I
In the
mean
home
they affect us.
in the home country, you mean?
No,
Or
I mean for us in the diaspora,
Mhm.
these issues, those issues that do
Right.
originate in the home countries,
Right.
yes, are they do in certain ways affect us more than the home countries. Say the various
Right.
efforts at having Episcopal assemblies
Right.
are very much affected by this situation, right?
Right.
But in a home country, certain issues don't play out the way they do for us.
Yeah.
Even certain issues, say, of the difference in calendars.
Mhm.
I think in the diaspora, we feel that issue more when side by side we might have a parish, a Greek Orthodox one, next to a Russian Orthodox one, next to a Serbian one, um, that might have different calendars, right? But in the home countries, they happen to have one calendar. So they, in most home countries,
Yeah.
I'm not talking about Ukraine either.
Yeah.
But I find that it's sometimes ironic that issues that really, as things stand now, seem to depend on the hires up that find themselves in the home countries
Yeah.
affect us more or less if we decide that we don't really care about them that much.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and I just don't. I think that sometimes there's no there's no question that decisions made at the institutional levels, in councils and by bishops, impact local Orthodox Christians. At the same time, however, too, I also think that there is movement amongst local Orthodox Christians that sometimes doesn't necessarily reflect the decisions made by council, by what I mean by local councils or local synods, and I think I see that even so. For example, the Orthodox Church of America was never really recognized as autocephalous, but there was intercommunion, good relations, members of the Orthodox Church of America and other Orthodox Christians. I think that at local levels, I think ROCOR priests, for example, are still working with their Greek Orthodox priests. I would even bet, although I'd have to go around and check, I mean, I would even bet that they might even be celebrating.
This I don't know.
Yeah, it's a little bit hard. I mean, I bet you at least in certain areas. So I do think there is a. I think what's different in the Orthodox Church is that when things happen at an institutional level, for example, in the Catholic Church, it tends to set a tone in parishes, and it tends to have a ripple effect globally. Even though there's a good amount of local Catholicism, let's say, that is distinctive from a certain kind of Vatican initiatives. I just think that, yes, I mean, we do have our Episcopal assemblies, we have our bishops, we have our local synods, they make decisions, they affect how our relations are with each other. But as Orthodox, we know what we believe, and we know where we worship, and we recognize Orthodoxy when we see it. And it gathers us all together. And I think that says something about the way we should think about our Orthodox faith, our Orthodox Church, and even Orthodox theology.
All right, thanks for that. So, yes, the higher up church politics is really not what determines our day-to-day existence and also unity as church, right?
Yes, I mean, I don't think it absolutely impacts it. Yes, it would. I mean, I think it would be perhaps naive for me to think that it doesn't have some impact in various areas, perhaps unevenly, but it doesn't have absolute impact. That's
right.
correct.
Mm-hmm. Not absolute impact. Yeah, that's. I'll agree that of course, it's not something we can generalize about. It's certainly something that, to some degree, affects us. But with the internet culture, perhaps, depending on how much one follows the news, it can impact us to various degrees. And that can be also confusing for people.
But the internet culture can cut both ways, because in Orthodoxy, Orthodoxy and ethnic and national identity were so intertwined that one time I was in Greece in 1990s, and I was visiting my friend, who Greek Orthodox Christian, and now is actually a scholar of New Testament, John Fotopoulos at University of St. Mary Notre Dame. And we were together, and we went to his family's village, and his uncle was there. And I remember him asking us this question. I remember asking point blank this question. He said, in Greek, he said, "Now, John, in America, are you the same religion as we are?" Right? So, I mean, you see in his mind, because we weren't Greek, and he probably knew that the Bulgarians, the Serbians, the Romanians, the Russians have the same religion, even though they're different ethnicities, but he wasn't clear about this American ethnicity thing. And I think, so the internet can cut both ways in the sense that at one time without the internet, perhaps these jurisdictional conflicts really didn't impact any of these local Christians who were just living their Orthodox lives, sort of being integrated within their ethnic and cultural and sort of national kinds of identities. But now the internet, there is an opportunity for us to realize a transnational Orthodox identity. And maybe all these conflicts are just a way of kind of our birth pains towards them.
That's very interesting. Birth pains. You know, birth pains, it reminds me of an expression that's literally used by St. Ignatius of Antioch. We have this online course. Have I mentioned it in this interview? Online course on church fathers. Just a smooth little, subtle little plug for our church fathers course. But he says his martyrdom is, you know, he's experiencing these birth pangs because his martyrdom's going to bring him new life.
Yeah.
And so I want to tie in and see what you have to say about this. How is our life in general, as our calling as Orthodox Christians, always tied to a path, in a sense, of martyrdom because of confessing the truth? And how does that lead to certain sacrifices?
Yeah, I mean, I think the truth-telling, there can be, again, one of the things that led me to thinking about truth-telling was this more general mission of mine to try to make sense of why we do or why we believe what we believe within our church. And for me, I think that the core that ties it all together is this wonderful God became human so that humans can become God. I mean, I do think that we're destined to become godlike, but to be godlike is not to, you know, be Thor or to be Zeus, but really to love as God loves in the world. And we always forget that the people that we might impulsively, or we don't even mean to think of them this way, is we might think of as unlovable. And that's been defined in various ways throughout the world, but at different times. But that God has no limits on God's love, and that's for us to become godlike is somehow to strive towards that kind of love of stranger, but even love of enemy, which is very, very difficult. And I think that what I've noticed is that it's fine to say that and to command it, and you have to love and love and love, and I find that though it's kind of hard to love. we have to be honest about how hard it is to love. It's hard to love our own family sometimes. It's hard to love our friends, and then Jesus ups the ante and says, "Yeah, love the stranger and love the enemy." And so love is, and I think this is where our ascetical tradition really sort of is so insightful. It's you can't really just command yourself to love differently the next day, and that requires a great deal of ascetical work. It requires us to engage in the ascetical practices like fasting and prayer to try to become more loving people. And one of the things I've noticed is that what we're aiming for is transformation. One of the things I've noticed is that certain kinds of truth-telling are transformative in such a way that we can notice ourselves being a little less angry, a little less hateful, a little less fearful. The three things, the three vices that Maximus says really get in the way of love.
You're, I like when you're talking about the actual truth-telling, because
Right.
Obviously we can be talking about different things, right?
Different kinds of truths,
We
like
we
where I'm
also
from, or
find it maybe painful in church discussions. There are certain things out of love that you might say we're not going to touch upon because we might have a different historical memory about certain things. Say with other Christians, the Fourth Crusade won't be remembered in the same way by, say, a Greek Orthodox Christian, and some, not all, right, Roman Catholic Christians. But we, say, in the ROCOR, share a different historical memory of the Second World War from
right.
people who live in Russia in the Moscow Patriarchate, those Orthodox Christians. And sometimes things need not to be talked about right now. I find, or we have found, as
Well,
a
they're
church.
they're not talked about because we're not aesthetically prepared to be able to have those kinds of truth-telling moments. And I think
Right.
that so I mean, look, I can say, let's say, I mean, if again, the truth-telling can be a lot of different things. Like, but the real transformative forms of truth-telling are the kinds of truth tellings where we're afraid to normally speak about the thing we're about to speak. So it could be something I did, it could be something that happened to me. It's amazing how people who are raped there's no fault there, but they don't want to speak about that truth to everybody and to even to themselves sometimes. It could
Right.
be something within one's family, but people are afraid to admit a truth. Again, no fault of their own, really, but a truth that associated with their family. I always think about the Virginia Tech shooter that happened about 20 years ago, and I remember hearing a news story where they talked about his sister, and I always thought, gee, what would it like to be her and say, oh, by the way, I'm that guy's sister, and that would be a very difficult thing. So I think that there are truths that we think about saying them, and then we feel this fear and anxiety. And that's a little bit of a tip off in many ways, that there's something important about that particular kind of truth. And then the way it can become transformative is that it depends on the listener, right? It depends really on the listener. And I can speak a truth to my brother, mother, wife, son, friend, stranger, therapist, priest. And each of those people symbolizes something a little bit different to me. And that's why I feel confession is so key, because no one can really iconicize the presence of God the way the priest can. And so there's all kinds of truth telling. I mean, yes, there is the truth of witness to that faith, but there is also the truth of someone saying, I don't get that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And there is also the truth of someone saying, why should I fast? I don't understand that. There's the truth of someone saying, I don't get this confession thing. Why does God care about, why can't I just do it in my room? And there's truths of when we say God became human, human could become, so that humans can become God. There's also the truth of, I was tortured in life. How does that actually relate to me?
Right.
And so I think that I think that there are many different kinds of truths. I do think that the martyrdom kind of truth, which has something to do with witnessing to the faith, witnessing to the faith in the face of perhaps political opposition and oppression. But I do think that when someone finds the strength to really speak a truth that they're afraid to speak about, there is a certain kind of dying to self that occurs.
Yes. Don't you think anytime even someone has to say no, say even in a church parish, say there's, as usual, the
Right.
same people doing everything, maybe some, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes it's some women, say, cleaning the church,
Right.
baking the pies or whatever for the bake sale, and so forth. And some people experience burnout. And there's a lot of people pleasing in the name of God, supposedly,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Priests suffer from burnout. that's not often talked about.
Right.
There is sometimes serious levels of, alcoholism amongst
Yes.
clergy,
Yes.
because also tied to burnout, not always. But I'm not saying that we walk around and gossip about this, right? But there is, I think, sometimes a very simple problem. One can tie in the whole Me Too thing also, but it's sort of, that's different. It's like on this, in the sexual area. But the general topic of the martyrdom of saying no. Also simply when you shouldn't be doing a job that's somebody else's.
Yes. I mean, I think that. So again,
Boundaries.
yeah,
That's the ascetical tradition, right, of
right.
Orthodoxy is about boundaries.
Well, I think a wrong way to see the ascetical tradition, and let's be honest, we do have certain stories that might push people in this direction. The bad way to see the ascetical tradition is to somehow push yourself to a limit that somehow is some kind of example of self mortification and sometimes this can be
Don't point at me.
well I so this could be sometimes
I am drinking Diet Coke,
with,
because of for ascetical reasons.
so, but this could also be with the priests who feels that they can't say no because somehow that wouldn't be true to this imagined sense of asceticism and pushing oneself. But I do think that part of good ascetical practice, good sort of Christian practice, is being aware of how one is feeling.
Because that would be turning it on its head, because it might look like asceticism or
Right.
obedience, but actually it might just be good old-fashioned people pleasing. That's not good for anybody.
That's correct. So
and it harbors resentment.
Right.
Right?
Because true asceticism, in the end, is something which enables us to love God and love neighbor.
Right.
And it may seem sometimes that we're kind of going the extra mile and doing all these kinds of making all these sacrifices for the parishioners, etc. But if you're kind of neglecting your family, or if you're neglecting your
Right.
health, or you see that you're not sleeping at night, or all these other kinds of things are going on, then there's some kind of ascetical misstep happening.
Right.
Right? Because it may seem like you're doing these things for the other, for the neighbor, but
maybe you're doing it out of fear.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Which feels people pleasing.
Right.
It's a very difficult topic because it's well, like everything else that's worth that brings our growth about. It's subtle.
Right.
It needs to be discerned.
Right.
It demands adult, grown-up thinking, and not just
And
a magic formula.
and conversation with the other person. Like
Yes.
that's why we have spiritual fathers and mothers in the church, because
And spiritual friends, right?
right.
Where we also confess.
Yes, confession is not a truth. The transformative power of truth telling for me is not exclusively confined to the relationship with the priest or the monastic. I mean, if I have a friend or therapist or mom or dad or someone that, and even sometimes sometimes for people who have experienced trauma, even anonymous truth tellings, there can be a certain transformative effect on the body. And what we're looking for, I think, in that transformative effect is living with a little less fear, anger, and hatred in our lives.
Right. Naming that monster
Right.
under the bed.
Right.
Then they're exposed, right?
Right.
That's really very refreshing. Thanks. I've jotted down this quote, and I thought it was really fascinating, and it connects all of this with martyrdom, truth telling, and why it involves sacrifice, right? Sorry, but it's a Jordan Peterson quote.
Yeah.
But I'm reading the book. Sorry. Error necessitates sacrifice to correct it. And then he writes, okay, so error necessitates sacrifice to correct it. And I'm thinking, there have been errors, both communally, say, as a society, okay, we're going to wrap this up soon, or in our own personal lives. And then the truth-telling that's correcting, that's bringing out the error that has occurred, involves pain.
Yeah.
That's where, like, confession as martyrdom comes in.
I just don't like the word correction, though, because, I think that when we make mistakes in life or things happen to us, we can't erase those things. And I think that the hardest thing for humans is to somehow write their own story, write their own narrative in such a way that it's not going to be perfect. And they have to integrate these faults and these things that they've done. And another ascetical practice is to resist not simply pride but self-loathing. And somehow one of the ascetical challenges is to accept error we've made, error that has kind of happened to us without us wanting it to happen, error that lives in the midst of our families, and somehow experience, cross and resurrection together. One of my favorite images really is this. The analogy might not quite work with error and correction and things like that, but maybe let's try to run with it. One of my favorite images, it's more in the Russian icons of the Ascension than the Greek ones, and in the Western tradition as well, of when Jesus ascends, the marks of the cross are still on Jesus' body. Which means that we're not forgetting the cross, we're not smoothing it over, Jesus didn't say, let's forgive and forget, that the marks of the cross are marked indelibly on the internal logos. And, somehow cross is at the heart of the cosmos. But, that's not fatalistic, that's not meant to be fatalistic, that's just meant to indicate that...
So he didn't take away the sins of the world?
We did, but that's just meant to indicate that... But we didn't forget the sins of the world. Forgiving doesn't necessarily mean forgetting. In other words, that somehow, we make mistakes, there are sins, there are errors. The power of God and of love and resurrection is that evil is not definitive. In the end, the power of God and the love of God is such that it can never be definitive, right?
Right.
And in that sense, though, however, what we see is that even when we have mistake, see, the reason why I don't like correction is when there's a mistake. So, for example, say when two people have a relationship with each other, it could be two friends, and there's betrayal, and then there's real forgiveness after the betrayal. Now that relationship is not corrected. It proceeds on the basis of the forgiveness of the error. The error is still part of the relationship. They talk about it, they have to write their story, they have to mention it. It's still there, but see, its power to divide, its power to destroy has been rendered, it's neutralized by forgiveness. Forgiveness, and that's how we talk about the devil. We're not correcting the devil, we're neutralizing the power, because he may still be up to his business and so on and so forth, but in the end, through love, through forgiveness, through grace, right, all those things which tend to get stirred up are not necessarily corrected, but I think that there's somehow God in this remarkable way carries that forward, but forward in such a way that perhaps can even make love possible in and through error.
Right. Yes, I agree. It's like the man who was paralyzed for 38 years. He takes his bed with him.
Right. Yes.
Right.
That's a great.
He doesn't leave it behind, that misery. Right. You're allowed to use it. You don't have to credit.
Yeah. No, I will reference it.
Would you like to say something to our viewers, Professor? Just to say, he's probably jet lagged.
No.
Just arrived at Vienna, so we've given him a sufficient dose.
I'll have to come back for part 2, but I would just say keep the faith. It's very easy to, given the pressures of the world, maybe some things are hard to understand, but there is understanding, and that understanding can be very powerful and can be very transformative. So just keep keep the faith and keep trying to understand as best you can our Orthodox faith, because it's really very powerful and very beautiful and life transforming.
Thank you. And thanks for what you do.
Yeah.
And I'm saying goodbye. Thank you, everybody, for all your support. Don't forget to get our little, this is our mini book for Lent. And even if you're not going to read it, accessorize with it. As I like to say, it's an attractive little book. Put it in your bag. You can take it with you. Reflections for every day of Lent. Okay? So you can be inspired just by looking at the cover. The colors are purple and black, appropriate for Lent. Like I said, if you're into wearing black, it really matches any of your outfits. So get the little book, available at our gift shop at coffeewithsistervassa.com. Lent is not that far away, my friends. Get the book. Everyone's getting it. Right, Telly?
Yes.
Everyone who's anyone has this book. You are the only ones who don't have the book if you're watching this and you don't have the book. Okay? That's the truth. Kelly, do you have one of these books?
Yes.
You can't believe a thing he says, everybody. Everything he said about truth-telling, forget it.
I'm telling the
Wasn't true.
truth.